It's very important. It's very important that we're steadfast in our support for Ukraine. Russia is the aggressor,
Even
and
if
Russia,
it unleashes nuclear war.
Russia has to be the one that makes the move to stop this war. It's within their gift, but we must support Ukraine. It's impacting not just Ukraine; it's impacting the rest of the world, including the UK.
A nuclear war might be coming, and nobody seems prepared for it. Starmer managed to convince Biden to carry out a disastrous operation that might finally push Putin over the edge. On top of that, Sir Softy finally showed some spine and bashed Putin for threatening nukes. That leaves us with a few questions. Is Putin done playing around?
Thanks, Prime Minister. Prime Minister, should Brits prepare for nuclear war?
Say that again.
Should Brits prepare for nuclear war?
Look, there's irresponsible rhetoric coming from Russia, and that is not going to deter our support for Ukraine. We're now on day 1,000 of that conflict. That's 1,000 days of Russian aggression, 1,000 days of sacrifice.
The very notion of a potential nuclear war is unbelievable. Even Starmer can't believe it, but the threat is very real. Many say that Putin is bluffing, but can we afford to take it as a joke? He immediately starts flaming Putin for being irresponsible, and his words keep getting harsher. It's quite the pleasant surprise watching Starmer being brutal for once. The cherry on top is that he's not talking nonsense. He sends back a very clear message to Putin, but it's equally as concerning for Britain as well.
I've been clear throughout those 1,000 days that we must give the Ukraine the support that is needed for as long as it's needed. That's something I've doubled down on here at G20 and in recent weeks. The simplest way to end this conflict is for Russia to stop the aggression.
And the missiles are a game changer.
Well, I'm not going to comment.
It's been confirmed. It's been confirmed by Russia that they have landed in their territory.
Starmer will not back off on the matter of supporting Ukraine, and that's set in stone. But this has some serious implications for us as well. Can we afford to support Ukraine like this? Even if it leads to a nuclear war? Our economy is already struggling, but still, compared to Russia, it seems to be a good thing that Starmer is standing up to him.
Russia's also threatened nuclear escalation. Are you comfortable with that when people at home are watching this, worrying that you could put us at risk?
Well, it's very important. It's very important that we're steadfast in our support for Ukraine. Russia is the aggressor,
Even
and
if
Russia,
it unleashes nuclear war.
Russia has to be the one that makes the move to stop this war. It's within their gift, but we must support Ukraine. It's impacting not just Ukraine; it's impacting the rest of the world, including the UK.
Starmer has made up his mind. Even if it puts us at risk, he will support Ukraine at the cost of nuclear escalation. He slams Putin again for his aggression and announces that there's a very simple way to end this conflict. The question remains, will Putin accept that solution or not? Especially after Starmer's been blasting him left and right. Starmer keeps doubling down every time he's asked about this. What led to this escalation was even more shocking. Biden and Starmer did the unthinkable.
My message is that we need to ensure that Ukraine is put in the best possible position. This is 1,000 days of conflict, and there is a very high cost if Russian aggression is seen to pay off, a cost that we will all pay, because this is not just about sovereignty in Ukraine, it's about our freedoms, it's about our way of life, and it impacts everybody across the United Kingdom.
1,000 days of conflict, and Starmer has finally taken a stand. It's not just the verbal bashing either. Starmer and his government are not playing on the back foot anymore. They're taking things up a notch and pushing back on Russia. Starmer even had a whole secret plan ready, and it ended up successful. And now, Putin's even more mad. In fact, that's the reason why the conflict has escalated so far.
Russian President Vladimir Putin is approving a revised nuclear doctrine that lowers the threshold for a nuclear response. Meanwhile, our NATO allies, Finland and Sweden, are now telling citizens to prepare for war. Sweden out with this new video informing residents on how to stockpile food, baby food, medication, and how to seek shelter during a nuclear attack.
The missiles that Biden approved based on Starmer's advice were launched into Russia by Ukraine, and that ticked Putin off. Putin has lowered the threshold required to retaliate with nuclear weapons, meaning he is now seriously considering striking back with nuclear missiles. It's getting serious, and countries like Finland and Sweden are already preparing for a nuclear war. Will we see similar preparations in Britain too? The more you look into the details, the more worried you get.
That sources have told us that Ukraine has fired UK-supplied Storm Shadow missiles into Russia. The missiles first given to Ukraine in May of 2023, and there had been long-running debate and calls from the Ukrainians to be allowed to fire those missiles on targets in Russia.
The Storm Shadow missiles that were incredibly destructive were supplied by the USA to Ukraine. They've used those missiles, but what's more interesting is that Britain supplied them just as deadly missiles. There's been no confirmation, but there's a high chance that they've been used too, or at least will be used soon.
I'd be quite surprised if they haven't been used for select targets further on, because they're a unique capability that are very, very effective at striking Russian logistics hubs, headquarters, ammunition dumps, exactly the sorts of things which Ukraine would have wanted to strike. But of course, it's the first time under this new regime, and we've noted that the Prime Minister has refused to make a statement on it, which actually I admire, because taking the flame, the heat out of this, because every announcement that gets made, President Putin jumps all over.
No wonder Putin is furious. The missiles were used to hit very important Russian targets and is a direct offensive attack by Ukraine. Russia can potentially use this as the perfect excuse to go on an all-out offensive, and as things stand, they might have the upper hand when it comes to war. Still, what Starmer did was incredibly admirable. He refused to confirm or deny the use of those British-supplied missiles, and that bound to leave Putin fuming. And considering his previous warnings, the situation is concerning.
Russia, the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin himself, has for months now warned the West against taking this step, saying that it would throw fuel onto the flames of the conflict, maybe even trigger a global war. The US and British officials have long cautioned against listening to these warnings from Moscow, but there has been hesitancy in taking this decision.
Only a couple months back, Putin warned the Western world not to get directly involved in the conflict. Biden and Starmer had been debating since then, and now they've finally given the go-ahead to the use of those missiles. But are we ready to deal with the potential consequences of Putin's warning? As serious as the threat may sound, many officials have said something exact opposite. They've accused Putin of bluffing, but the reality of the matter remains to be seen. More and more evidence suggests that it's anything but a bluff, as another unexpected player has joined the conflict on Russia's side.
And we shouldn't forget that Keir Starmer was pushing President Biden on this earlier in the summer, as I think Deborah mentioned there. My own view is that this is long overdue, that the Russians used this sort of idea of red lines to try and put fear into Ukraine's allies, and they've been rather successful. We've restricted ourselves from giving Ukrainians the support they need as a result.
People are incredibly conflicted. They can't decide if Putin is a madman or a serious threat. On one side, he has been threatening this for quite a while and still hasn't actually done anything. Is Putin scared of the West? But at the same time, we can't afford to take his warnings lightly. Putin is a madman, and who knows what will finally push him to launch the nukes. Finland and Sweden have already started preparing, so maybe things are more serious this time.
As has been reported, what the major escalation which has occurred is the entry of another country's army into this war, and that is North Korea. So the sort of threats of escalation that we hear from Putin are largely empty.
North Korea sent its army to help Russia in the conflict, and that's bound to have major implications. Both Putin and Kim Jong-un aren't exactly known for being diplomatic, and their actions are impulsive. If they're willing to go this far, there's no doubt that they're already working on bigger plans against the West.
So we're struggling to keep pace with Russia's wartime armaments production, and that's not even bringing into account, obviously, the supplies they're also getting from North Korea and Iran, among others.
Russia is prepared for war. They've been completely restructuring their economy to focus on producing more weapons, and the difference is huge. Can we compete against that even if we tried? Especially since our economy is already struggling. And it's not just Russia alone that's a threat. Putin has great relations with Iran, China, and North Korea. If things keep escalating, one side will keep trying to one-up the other.
Quite often we end up with a gap. So do we have, for example, amphibious landing craft? Do our Royal Marines have the ability to do what Royal Marines are supposed to be able to do? So I think there are lots of holes in Britain's overall defence picture, and our ability to be a fairly serious defense player.
Starmer is actively provoking Putin, and we have huge gaps in our defense. We're heading into a very sensitive period for the entire world, and Britain is at the center of it. A good number of our military assets are becoming outdated, and we have not allocated enough funding to develop newer technology. On top of that, the military assistance that we have been giving Ukraine is incredibly expensive. Those Storm Shadow missiles alone aren't easy to develop. So, is Putin really bluffing? And if he isn't, how are we going to deal with it?
Have the Russian president, up until now, warning the West of dire consequences should the US, or the UK for that matter, grant the Ukrainians the permission to use these longer-range missile systems. For the US, it sees it the ATACMS ballistic missile. For the UK, it's the Storm Shadow cruise missile. That should they grant that permission, that they are playing with fire.
Russian intelligence has confirmed that Britain was involved in the attack by giving authorization for the missiles. The threats from Putin are getting more severe, and he has warned us of dire consequences. And those consequences have arrived. Needless to say, it's nothing pretty, and Starmer is indeed playing with fire. We are on the verge of a global conflict.
Coincidence, therefore, that the Russians today are announcing or finalising what was already in the planning, this lowering of the threshold of when Russia would consider using nuclear weapons in response to an attack. Under this updated doctrine, the Russian military could resort to a nuclear strike if the country is under conventional attack.
In direct response to this, Russia has finalized the lowering of its nuclear retaliation threshold. They can now fire off nuclear weapons if they think that they're under attack. This is a huge change from Russia's previous policy, and the timing of this change is concerning.
Of when a nuclear strike, a nuclear retaliation would be considered by Russia was in response to a nuclear attack or a conventional attack that threatened the very existence of the state. Of course, we know, and British and American officials repeatedly say, that Russia does not want a nuclear war because there would be no winners. But clearly an incredibly important and worrying, but obviously unsurprising development.
They've now updated the policy, allowing Russia to use nukes whenever they feel like it. This includes if Putin wakes up on the wrong side of the bed. There's a very clear reason for this, and it's a direct statement for the West. It means Putin is listening to Starmer's words and he's retaliating back. But Starmer struck back, slamming Putin by doubling down on his support for Ukraine. Russia has been using this as an excuse to double down on the attacks. Despite all the support Ukraine has been getting, will they be able to win against Russia?
And that really does underline the US and the British thinking here. They say, when they talk about it, that this isn't about attacking Russia, it's about defending Ukraine. Russia has been able to use the fact that Ukraine has had its hands tied by these limitations in the use of the weapons that they've been given by the West, with not being able to strike deep into Russia, from where Russia is launching long-range missile attacks, drone attacks, aircraft strikes on Ukrainian territory.
Without us, Ukraine's hands are tired, and it won't be able to stand a chance against Russian aggression. If that were to happen, there would be severe implications for the rest of us. Putin won't stop just at Ukraine, and his expansion, as well as his threats, will keep going forward. There's no appeasing him, so it's good that Starmer is pushing back. He's simply announcing to Putin that we're not scared of him. However, is this enough to stop Putin? Doesn't seem like it.
It's not a game-changing, war-ending development for Ukraine. There are limitations with the use of these new weapon systems, not just in the range, but also in the quantity. For example, for British Storm Shadow cruise missiles, we don't know yet whether the UK has granted the Ukrainians permission to use them, but we do know that there is only a very finite stockpile of them, and they take a long time to build and replenish the supplies.
Sure, Ukraine has cruise missiles and many more destructive weapons, but it's nothing compared to the Russian arsenal. Moreover, the weapons that Ukraine is being supplied with are very limited, and Ukraine might be using them up faster than we can supply them. So, if we haven't done anything significant yet, are we headed towards World War III?
World War III on the screen? on the horizon?
Yes, perhaps I'm not harking back to the past. Maybe I'm just looking forward and preparing for the inevitable life in a prisoner of war camp. I don't think that this is going to lead to nuclear war. Just got to be completely honest. It would be a massive overreaction to the deployment of these missiles. They are very good missiles. They can hit Russian infrastructure deep inside Russia, but it's not like they're intercontinental ballistic missiles, and it's not like Ukraine actually has nuclear capabilities.
Russia has suffered quite a blow, but would that be enough to push Putin that far? According to many Western experts, Putin wouldn't dare to take such a drastic step as it'd be a huge overreaction. But then again, Putin has been behaving very impulsively, so there's no telling as to what he's capable of. Reason dictates that starting a war with the entire world over a few logistic hubs being destroyed would be something incredibly stupid, and maybe Putin is just scared and relies on meaningless threats.
Basically, here's my message. Vlad, I think you're a pussy. I really, really do. I simply do not think that. I know he's killed with his own cold hands. Of course he is. He's a murderous, tyrannical dictator.
KGB agent.
KGB agent. I don't think for a moment that he's brave enough to do so. I also don't think that he has enough military people who would back him. We saw what happened when there was that attempted coup by the Wagner Group. I mean, the army literally just stood aside and said, "On you go. Keep on moving to Moscow."
Starmer said it. He's not afraid of Putin, and now everyone else is saying the same. They're calling him a coward who wouldn't dare to face the combined wrath of the West. We all know what happened when a militant group tried to overthrow Putin and almost succeeded. There's also speculation about Ukraine getting its own nuclear program with the help of the West. At the same time, Starmer is tempting fate by continuously calling Putin out. What if he actually does it this time? We will have to deal with the consequences of a nuclear war.
And the weaponry at the time. So this war of attrition has meant that more and more Ukrainians are just dying, frankly, needlessly.
Although Russians are dying at a far higher rate. 1,600 a day killed or seriously wounded.
Has a much, much larger pool to draw on. They can do this. That's the reality. And this was always the danger, was a drawn-out war of attrition,
and
which
Vladimir
Russia will
Putin
win.
simply doesn't care how many Russian men he kills.
And he's re-augmented the entire economy. Actually, other countries like India and China, they don't care about Western sanctions. They're more than happy to sell and do business with Russia. The Russian economy is doing fine.
Russia has some powerful allies, and it's a huge country with seemingly endless manpower. Putin doesn't care how many soldiers he sacrifices, and he has no shortage of soldiers. The sanctions are useless as many countries are still more than happy to trade with Russia. Take India, China, North Korea, Iran. All of them combined have ensured that the Russian economy is perfectly fine. They face no threat from Western diplomatic pressure.
Be clear, if Russia were to actually use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, Ukraine would get nuclear weapons very quickly. It has the capacity to get them, and there are lots of countries that would be more than happy to sell that technology to them. It would lead to an escalation, though, in other countries around the world going, right, well, we're all going to get nuclear weapons now, and it doesn't matter if it's Japan or Saudi Arabia or Azerbaijan. Lots of these countries are actually trying to...
There's no possible way for Russia to win this war. If they use the weapons, Ukraine will level the playing field with our help. Igniting another global arms race is the last thing that we want, as countries who should never have nukes will start getting access to them.
Vladimir Putin makes threats all the time. When he threatened to effectively invade Ukraine, people didn't take him seriously. On this, I think people are going to take him too seriously. I don't think that you can go through life and, as a Western leader and as Western populations and just say, well, you know, he's a murderous dictator, he's a threat, we just can't do anything to make him angry because he might do that.
Starmer has finally taken the right approach in dealing with Russia's threats. He's sending a message that we're not scared anymore, and that's frankly refreshing to see. After all his political blunders, Starmer has managed to get his head straight for once, and maybe he needs to step it up further. This might be the only reasonable method for us to deal with Putin.
You need to say enough is enough. No, well, come along if you think you're hard enough. The reality is, Vladimir Putin cannot stand the full might of NATO forces, particularly American forces, if they choose to deploy them. If he goes nuclear, we're in a different territory. He's not that stupid, and there aren't enough people around him who are that stupid to allow it to happen.
A firm stance to put a stop to all of this madness. Putin may be a madman, but he's not stupid. He's surrounded by a bunch of advisors who know the consequences of a nuclear war with NATO, and they would never let him do it. The way things are going, Starmer and Biden's secret plan might actually work out in our favor. Their goal is to make Putin fear the war and then force him to withdraw from Ukraine. Starmer deserves more support for this, and you can show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Who knows, maybe he'll start being smart with our internal policies too.